Third, we have a collectivist explanation. At first glance, the collectivist explanation appears to be more modern, but we also do have in antiquity cases where political communities define themselves by specific features. At least the boundary between inside and outside is a criterion we can find in all states or state-like entities. Whatever the criteria, to give some examples, it could be the common language or dialect, common customs or traditions. They define a community and set it apart from other communities. Much more recent is the understanding that a collective is a people, or more specifically, one people with a common history, with a common heritage, whereby this heritage may be in the dark and impossible to unearth. Consequently, we should not be too surprised to find a mixture of real and fictitious features. But this common heritage or history is, if believed in, what sets one political collective apart from another. Also quite recent is the idea of a nation, or a nation-state, as we sometimes call it. Obviously, it can be explained as one big family that shares blood and soil. Surely, we need to identify bonds that hold a nation together. Analytically speaking, a nation is community and people merged into one. The history of nationalism is, despite common belief, relatively short. Like all the other isms going back to the French Revolution, it is difficult to imagine the rise of nationalism without Napoleon Bonaparte, or rather the European reaction to his military campaigns. Nationalism, like socialism and communism in the 20th century, developed both a strong international and national component. Appeal to worldwide solidarity and national awakening are not necessarily opposites, as might be expected. They are rather complementary. Like in a Gestalt switch, the one abruptly changes into the other. We-feeling is not always an expression of collectivism. Since man is a social animal, his group orientation is part of his nature. We attach possessive pronouns to things dear to us. My wife or husband, my parents, my children, but also my village, my church, my school, and even my country. All these attachments do not carry political weight. We know, at least intuitively, that my country is not the same as my state. And yet, even nationalists don't speak of my state. What gives it political significance is the myth without which no political entity would be able to justify its existence. To mention just one such example, the American Declaration of Independence. After a short introduction to some general principles of the Enlightenment, we find lies piled upon lies in the central part. The conclusion at the end is based on false premises, and although a logical error, a fantastic action program. In a political context, we could call such myths foundation myths. We idealize the founding fathers, capitalized, as if they were divine messengers or archangels. We enshrine a piece of paper taken out of context. We reroute ourselves. The myth is born, and from the day of its acceptance, it lives its own life. What started merely as an image, an idealized and distorted idea anchored in history, comes alive through reference and reenactment. It becomes a political force as soon as it morphs a non-political community into a political compound, gives it direction, and energizes it. Undoubtedly, popular sovereignty depends to a greater degree on collectivist ritualization than a divinely legitimized regime. Nonetheless, all political systems collect smaller or larger groups and associate them at least partly with their very existence. Even where a national identity does not result from such association, boundaries, visible and invisible ones, are erected and constitute a state. The boundary between a political collective and its surrounding world, filled with competitors and rivals, leads us to the problem of functional specification, dealt with next. The fourth way of explaining the state is functional. Society cannot work naturally, so to say. Society needs to be organized. And this, so common belief, can only be done by what is permanent. State, after all, comes from the Latin stare, meaning to stay or to stay on. Compared to the shortness of human life, longevity is definitely an aspect of the state. But the functional view emphasizes the superiority of organized society over unorganized society. Even today, we retain a good part of that view by setting any form of statism in contrast to anarchy. Anarchy means non-organized society. For some, it means nothing but chaos. It does not need a Hobbes to abhor the absence of security. Security must be produced because there is a demand for it. However, so some say, security is not a good like any other. Therefore, it must be taken care of by the most powerful agent, and whoever that is, we call him the state. Substantiable or not, the argument is definitely interesting and deserves to be followed up. Last but not least, because it has had a strong influence in political theory. The right to life, liberty and property, so John Locke, can only be secured in the presence of a law enforcer. No thinker of the Enlightenment, with the possible exception of Etienne La Boétie, could imagine civilized life without a monopolistic law enforcer, the state. The questions they discussed were questions concerning its structure, absolute versus constitutional, and its size, big with a standing army and a centralized bureaucracy, versus small, with only a court system and a militia. What an irony of history that the men who were preoccupied with checks on a personal state forced open the door to the omnipotent, impersonal, modern state. Following in Plato's footsteps, the Enlightenment treated power as inevitable but controllable by intelligence and education. Reform rather than revolution was written on its banner. But the biting sarcasm of the intelligentsia ridiculed and thus undermined the old regime to such an extent that it was morally too weak to stem the tide when economic and fiscal crises fueled violence. Violence eventually gave birth to a new regime under which the state drastically increased its power. And violence was henceforth written into its genes. The violent outbursts were frequently interpreted as the inevitable birth pangs of a new and also better age. Some wiser scholars, however, spotted in them the crux of all political power. The need and difficulty to bring power under control. They cautioned the utopian dreamers that power, in whatever name, won't stop at nothing including itself. Sooner or later it mutates from functional to dysfunctional. Political science needs to study the parameters that indicated the derailment and thus allowed for accurate predictions. A whole array of new research fields open up, ranging from democracy theory to peace theory. Hardly any of these studies focused on core issues. A growing number of them had a clear ideological message or were apologetical, justifying an existing political order or breaking ground for a new order. Rather than restating and explaining the problem of security, the problem now was explained away. Eventually, it was left to economists to re-investigate it. What resulted from this change of perspective is impressive. The taboo surrounding security vanished, and with it the unspoken claim of political science to solely understand and speak the secret language of the Holy Grail. There's yet another way of explaining the state.